Hi, good evening, and thank you for joining us on day 309 at Good Governance Yaya, GGY. We have a very special guest with us, Rohan Pethiagura. Rohan, thank you so much for joining us. Just to tell you, we've actually known as Gota Goyaya before, and we changed it to Good Governance Yaya after Gota left because the name became a little redundant. Thankfully, we're still GG. So today we have Leisha, Adi Mowbray, Manik, Damaris, and Priyangani are on the table, and we also have Chris and Travis at the back. They've decided to take a back seat, so we have a heavily female, which is sort of how the GGY group is anyway. Yes. So Rohan, let me just introduce you to everyone. We're honored to have you, Rohan, with us, a renowned biodiversity expert whose groundbreaking work has led to the discovery and description of over 100 species in Sri Lanka. He has received numerous international accolades, including the prestigious Linnean Medal. Did I say that right? Linnean Medal. Beyond his scientific contributions, Rohan is a vocal advocate for transparency and governance, having spoken out strongly against corruption, including recent controversies like the visa outsourcing and wind power deals. So we're very happy to have you here, Rohan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome.
So let's jump straight in. So from the beginning, Rohan, we have been advocating for a certain set of outcomes, and that's stuff born out of the Aragalaya. It's good governance, equal application of the law, justice, accountability for past crime scams, particularly things like the Easter bombing, and Chris usually reads out a list of all the unresolved scams and things like that, transparency and overall sort of system change. So it is in that spirit that we generally have these conversations. So to start with, you're a renowned scientist. How did your interest in science merge into political advocacy and even activism?
I served about half my career in government as a government servant. I started my career in the health ministry, and I was one of the youngest people who ever became a director in the health ministry, I think at the age of 28 or something like this. Okay. So I had a really good start in life there. And as a very young public servant with a job that carried a lot of weight and what they would now call power, but I don't like that word, heft in some form, I got exposed to how government works. So it was an honor to have that experience, because from there I got a good break by being chairman of the Water Resources Board, again quite young in my life. And I also have, in a sense, a kind of advantage or disadvantage in being related on all sides to politicians.
Right, okay.
So my wife is the younger sister of Gamini Dissanayake, who was the presidential candidate from the UNP earlier. So that means his two sons who are now in politics are nephews.
Nephews, yeah.
And on the other side, my mother's sister's daughter is Shiranti Rajapaksa, who's married to my So politics is very much in the system. Which reason I'm very careful not to take political sides. That's been my...
This has been your ecosystem.
Yes, it is my ecosystem, but I navigate a very perilous path there, so that I try not to take sides one way or the other, politically.
Right. So let's see how this conversation goes. But we had a pandemic followed by an economic collapse, and we also had the popular uprising. What do you see as the most critical issues facing the country right now? Do you think people are losing sight of those system change sort of goals that people had advocated for at the time? Because I remember you speaking up for those as well at the time.
Yes, I was a passionate advocate of Aragalaya, though I didn't subscribe, and I spoke out against the idea that the 225 must go. Yeah. I felt that there were some things that were not wisely dealt with by the Aragalaya, but what would you expect with literally 1 million people calling for what they thought was the main objective at the time. So I felt that it was important to respect the democratic institutions that we have and not deviate from those. Even though at the time people had lost faith in democracy, because it was democracy after all that got Gotabaya to that job. And so this was a bit of an experience that I worried about. But the thing is, what was most wonderful about that, especially was it July 9th when the final
July 9th. We were all there.
event happened. I mean, I have video of that I keep on my laptop. Whenever I feel depressed about this country, I just watch that.
Yeah.
And it's still, the way in which young people, absolutely peacefully, I know a couple of people got killed, but not because they were violent, but because one guy fell off a wall, another guy was, I think, injured in some way. What would you expect when you have like hundreds of thousands of people? But the peacefulness, the cheerfulness, and I have in one of my videos, it shows a loudspeaker, somebody, when they broke into the president's office, announcing, saying, don't burn anything, behave yourself, like making this continuous announcement, asking for good behavior. And people were a little euphoric, but of course very well behaved. And so that was a good form of democracy, when you could see how easily it could go wrong, like it did it recently in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
But even before that, we saw the collapse of North African democracy in the wake of the Arab Spring.
Yes.
So what started off as a pro-democracy movement ended up with just ushering in a range of dictatorships across those northern countries, all the way from Syria to Morocco. So revolution is a very dangerous thing.
Right.
It's very rarely that a revolution ends better than it started. Right. The American Revolution is perhaps the one exception.
Right.
But every other revolution in the world has ended up better than worse than it started off.
So the outcome is not necessarily...
The outcome is almost always bad.
Bad.
And I worry for Bangladesh because of that. Because Mr. Yunus, of course, is a wonderful person. But is he going to be a statesman? That's another thing. I've stayed out of politics partly because I know that while I'm probably a competent analyst and critic, I would be lousy as a cabinet minister. I wouldn't do that.
Right.
I've had, goodness knows, enough invitations to get involved in politics, but I've stayed away from it because I know that I'm not competent to do the job.
Right. So, I mean, in a way, we had the Aragale end with a president who, through his legislative agenda, actually has moved towards a more authoritarian form of governance. Right, all the laws that have been brought in and so on. So now with an election coming up, I think a lot of that positivity and that euphoria has definitely subsided, and I think we are retreating to our tribal sort of political corners now. How do you see the outcome of all of that?
The left-right divide in Sri Lanka has always been slightly left-biased.
Yeah.
I think from independence onwards,
Right.
in terms of us having a kind of socialist preference in politics. There is a national socialist preference. The highest vote that the UNP got was about 53% in its best year, I think, in 1982 or something.
Yeah.
But that is as a monolithic party. The right has always been a monolith. This is the first time it's divided between Sajaba and the president. The left has always been fragmented with CP, LSSP, SLFP.
Right.
There's been a jigsaw puzzle on the left that with difficulty comes together. Now we see the left having consolidated basically into an NPP.
Right.
So it's NPP with a little tail of Namal and then Sajid with a little tail of Ranil, as I see it.
Right.
That is going to determine this election. And to my kind of rather cynical, analytical viewpoint, I think if Ranil does badly, it will help, of course, the NPP to win, and if on the other side Namal does well, it will help Sajid to win. So the better Namal does, the better it is for the Sajid. So a lot of this is the way that people decide to vote at the time. It's not so much what they want as how fragmented we are in not being able to come up with a two-party system in Sri Lanka. Because most countries have a two-party system, and that's quite healthy because it helps, every election becomes a referendum.
Right, and it focuses people a bit more perhaps.
Yeah, because then you have very clear-cut choices to make. Now it's very complicated. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah, so we have new parties emerging, which is far left of the NPP, and then we have people like the Sentinel Front, which is more to the centre. Would you say SJB and NPP are fairly towards the centre now? I mean, in terms of politics, or are they also still
in terms
very
of
far
rhetoric,
apart?
they're far apart. That is the thing. The rhetoric that comes from the NPP, depending on whom you listen to from that side, the aisle, is certainly not free market liberal capitalism.
Right.
So it's slightly different from if you listen to Harsha, for example, talking on behalf of
Saddam,
who was very, very. Oh no, I didn't mean competence. I meant different.
Different.
His approach to a market economy as opposed to a more controlled socialist economy, economy that sees state-owned enterprises as integral to a successful country, and one that sees them as being an encumbrance.
Right. So actually, we did a small exercise where we compared all three manifestos with an AI engine. I think those results will surprise us. So we have one guy here who used to say 225 get out. That's Chris. Remember?
225 plus 1.
Plus 1 get out, yeah. So Rohan, bringing you back to like things that you've been advocating for. There was a video that you released recently where you introduced the concept of corruption futures, which you call a new financial instrument. Could you help us understand what you mean by this?
So traditional corruption, if you remember, I'm not saying something defamatory because he has said it of himself. Basil Rajapaksa himself has referred to himself as Mr. 10%.
Yeah.
There was a time when corruption meant keeping a little bit on the side.
On the side, yeah.
Now we are seeing a completely different transformation of that because there's no capital expenditure happening in government because we are insolvent.
Yeah.
So it's not that there's no capital expenditure, but this year there'll be about 1.1 trillion rupees of capital, which sounds like a lot, but actually it's not that much. And so because capital has dried up, people who want to make money have to look at different ways of doing this. And one possibility is to give long-term contracts into the future so that our children and grandchildren are bound to contracts that they're honored to keep. There is a lot of pressure, for example, right now by the Adani people and the people who want them to get this project in Mana and Pune to sign the contract before the election.
Yeah.
Because then the incoming government is stuck with having to go and tell the Indians, we have to invalidate a contract that is legally valid. That is very embarrassing for an incoming government.
And could also be costly, right? I mean, I think when we cancelled the LRT project,
yes,
we had to pay the Japanese government.
Huge cost to bear. So there is a lot of pressure on the Central Environment Authority, on the Public Utilities Commission and so on to somehow ratify this thing so that this power purchase agreement can be signed. Remember, Cabinet approved this on the 6th of May this year.
Right.
It's been hanging around without being translated into a power purchase agreement thanks to courageous government servants, people like the Director General of the CEA and senior officials in the PUCSL, who have said, no, we're not going to sign it, you have to demonstrate that you're compliant with law.
Right.
And this is difficult to do because the government's got to put its foot in it by saying they have to circumvent the tender procedure because this is a government-to-government transaction. But there's no evidence to show that it's a government-to-government transaction.
Right.
So now they're talking about I'm sorry, I'm going to label this point just because I haven't
made it. No, please go ahead. I was going to come to the
I haven't made it before.
Agreement anyway.
No, we'll come back to that. But
sure.
Just to say why this government-to-government thing. Apparently, there was a joint statement made by the High Commissioners of India and Sri Lanka at some point. I haven't seen this, but it's probably true. That Sri Lanka said that they will collaborate with India in the power sector. It sounds a very general statement to me. Nowhere does it say we will give projects to Adani. But this is now being interpreted to justify why the government is giving it to this one party. So my argument is sometimes it's necessary for us to engage with a country like India and there has to be a quid pro quo. So we might say, all right, we'll give you power sector projects, you give us such and such. In that case, our solution is to call for tenders from Indian companies. Only India can compete for the following power sector projects. That's fine. Yeah. At least there is some degree of transparency. But we didn't even do that. We just selected one person, a highly controversial person by any standard, and then we run with that, which was my objection.
Right. Okay. So basically, what you're saying is these projects that they sign up, which they're rushing to sign before the election because they don't know what the outcome will be. The corruption is already baked into the cake, and we are stuck with it. We're stuck eating it for the next 12 to 20 years.
20 years.
So that is the futures. It's like a bond, but corrupt.
And this is why it's so terrible, because especially when it comes to wind power, wind power prices have been collapsing world over because there's so much manufacturing coming into wind turbines. So big companies in the West which developed the wind technology have now walked away from it because it's not profitable enough for them. China and India are manufacturing really competitively priced wind turbines now. And so we can generate wind power for about 2.5 US cents. So if you look, 7 rupees and 50 cents for a unit of electricity, which is way lower than anything we're paying now. And so as the market collapses, when you not only agree to a much higher price, almost 3 times the going price, if you will, but also fix that for 20 years, at a time when the market is collapsing, this is sinful in the extreme. And that's why I thought I'm going to confront Ranil Wickremesinghe directly, because he is responsible as Minister of Finance and as President and head of the Cabinet for having let these things through. So it's his apologists come and tell me, look, he is not in this, it's other people around him. I really don't care, because as a citizen, it's his job, he's in that chair to take care of the problem. So it's his job to stop people around him. But he's also known for another comment he made a long time ago on another corruption issue, which when brought to him and shown that another minister was taking bribes. This was in the Sunday Leader newspaper. He said, don't think of me as a class monitor.
Okay.
Those were his
That's a troubling statement from a leader.
That's a very troubling statement.
Yeah.
He really doesn't see himself as being the person who has to instill discipline in his cabinet. So his thing is let them run amok.
No, so the apologist strategy, the Ranilist strategy is take credit for the positives and just ignore the rest. And I think by ignoring that, they're enabling it to a certain extent, because we have ministers who are credibly accused of various things who are still serving in cabinet, including the people behind these particular projects. Yeah. So in terms of the power purchase agreement, I think they've agreed at 826.
Cabinet has agreed.
Agreed on 826, whereas I think you've pointed out that
the open tenders
lowest bid of 488. Have they ever justified why those bids were rejected?
No.
Nothing.
So this has not been justified. There's verbal justifications made to me by apologists of the Adani group. When they talk to me, their argument is that they've got to put in some wiring, which I found is not really a big difference. It's less than 1 cent.
Yeah, that there's capital expenditure,
but that's been separately quoted in their proposal.
Also.
The other thing is that they don't get the carbon credits, but then in Sri Lanka, nobody gets the carbon credits. Right. That's another story. Maithripala Sirisena went and gave away all Sri Lanka's carbon credits at Paris in 2015. So that was another disaster, but let's not go there. So there's no carbon credits to be had there. Yeah. This has already been sacrificed. So basically, the idea of the futures thing is that you can sign a contract now and get yourself paid from the excess money that's been made, as if you're a corrupt politician, for the next so many generations to come.
Right. CK, if you can go to this slide. So you've made a calculation. So you basically said excess payment to Adani is 67,600,000 per year. Yes. 20 years, 1.3 lost to Sri Lanka rupees 400 billion, right? I mean,
it's much more than that.
Yeah.
You see, so what I've taken there is the 8.26 cents that was approved by Cabinet to be paid to Adani, less the 4.88 cents which came up in the CEB tender.
Oh, so that's a surplus.
It's costing us more.
Yes, so Adani. But remember that the actual difference is much greater, because the CEB tender was for 50 megawatts. Adani has got the advantage of scale because his tender is for 500 megawatts,
which means they can generate for less.
Right? They can generate for a lot less.
Right.
That's the first point. The second thing is that Adani is getting to do this as a foreign investor with all the BOI breaks he gets. Those are unspecified, but those could include tax holidays, it could include duty concessions on import. None of those breaks are given to the guy who quoted the 4.88 cents. Right? So we really can't make an accurate comparison, but the difference is at least the 400 billion I pointed to.
Right.
It's probably substantially more than that.
So this is the cost of corruption over the 20 years in just one particular deal, in one particular ministry, in one particular sector.
Is this contract signed, finished?
Not yet.
Not yet. No.
So that's what I said. The officials are blocking it to the best of their ability. If they can block it for the next 10 days, I think then the judiciary will take over.
Will take over and come to a judgment on that. So can you tell us, I mean, this is in an environmentally sensitive area as well, this particular project. Can you tell us a little bit about the environmental impact of putting such a large-scale project in a sensitive area like this?
Mannar Island is probably the greatest wind resource in the whole of South Asia. There is no place in India or anywhere else in Sri Lanka that has such a big wind resource.
Right.
So I think regardless of what environmental objections come, the future will see wind power being extracted from Mannar.
Okay.
Our challenge is to try and bring in the technology that's possible to prevent birds from being killed as they fly through this.
Okay.
So there's a lot of work being done on birds using this corridor. It's the flyway that funnels birds from India into Sri Lanka every year. So they come here to winter.
Migratory.
And they come right through Mannar. So they have this problem of running into turbines, but not all birds are affected by turbines. It's mainly birds of prey. And these turbines, I mean, we think of them as these slow-moving objects, but actually the tips of those turbines are turning at about 350 kilometers an hour in a good wind. They're really moving fast.
Yeah.
So birds have got no clue this is happening. And also, as Professor Sampath Saniviratna points out, birds are geared in flight to look down. They have no interest in looking up.
Yeah.
They're pretty useless at looking up because there's nothing there for them to see.
Especially if you're the predator.
Exactly. So they are always looking down and they don't see what's happening from up there. So there's a whole lot of technical reasons for which birds are affected negatively by wind farms. The judgment that's got to be made in Sri Lanka is not whether birds are going to be affected by wind power, whether in Mannar or everywhere else, but what price we are willing to pay for cheap energy.
Right.
Going forward, Sri Lanka has to invest in wind, and this investment has to take place in the coastal areas. The wind resources in the mountains are quite good, but getting these huge turbine blades into the mountains is very, very difficult. Each of those blades is more than 100 meters long, and windy roads means you can't really get them into the hills easily. So places that
in fact, in one of your videos, you had depicted them.
I show.
Like each one is like a lotus tower. It's that big.
They're huge. Yeah. So this is an engineering challenge, but of course these challenges can be overcome, but not easily. And the other thing, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons for which I'm like iffy about this. Sri Lanka has to invest in wind in a big way. The Adani's present projects in Sri Lanka for the 500 megawatts is probably less than 1/10 of what we need. And so I think a thoughtful government will look at how much of this can be generated locally in terms of the engineering and the work. Those towers are basically steel towers. This is not high tech. There's no reason we can't insist that they be built in Sri Lanka, for example. It'll keep people in work rather than just importing everything from India and giving work to
a new industry.
Yeah, exactly. It's a whole industry.
That expertise you could export.
Yeah, because there is a future, and India is now the major exporter in the world. I mean, American wind power is largely manufactured in India. So I think that we could have given opportunities to Sri Lankans also to engage in this thing, but I'm not saying that's the reason I'm against the project. I'm against the project not even on environmental grounds, because I think this technology will come. My environmental concern is that the law has to be followed.
Yeah.
Because we have environmental regulations, and if we follow those regulations and the regulations allow a project like this, we have to accept it.
So how did this get past an environmental impact assessment? How does it get past that?
It hasn't got passed. So the objections that have been made, for example, by the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society, still haven't been addressed by the CEA. So the environmental impact assessment was published fairly. I mean, I objected to it, of course, but the thing is, it's largely a good document, but with some big weaknesses. The problem with environmental impact assessments in general in Sri Lanka is that there's only a small number of companies that do this with the same bunch of academics from universities that are drawn into that. And the company that does the impact assessment is under pressure to give it a pass, because if they fail it, they'll never get a job again.
Yeah.
So I think the way we have to do this is some form of randomizing. So you can have 3 people pre-qualified to do the assessment, and then you draw lots for who's going to get it. So then there is a little, it's, you know, like in the firing squad, they have one guy with a blank in the rifle. So
it'll be like
something like that.
Right.
So that the party that...
Couldn't we seek international help for something like this? Because for these large projects, I mean...
For impact assessments?
Yeah, wouldn't that have more credibility if you brought in experts from overseas for something like
the
this?
The expertise available here is fantastic.
Okay. But then there's like these issues with, you know, corruption vulnerabilities and
so
things like that.
We have to, I think there's ways of, like I said, I'm sure there's other ways as well, of shielding those people from losing business in the future.
Right.
I think that can be done effectively. It's just that we don't have a system that does it.
One other quick question. The cost of renewable energy, what's the advantage of wind over solar? Could we look at solar more?
Solar is cheaper, but remember, solar is only during the day.
Yeah.
So this is another discussion. I'll come back.
Yeah, storage, all that.
That's a conversation I'd love to have, but it needs a longer discussion than you've got here today. Wind and solar are both cheap. We can't have too much of it. The government's planning to have 70% renewables by 2030. Okay. That's not achievable, because at that level you've got to have storage, and we don't have storage yet.
Right. So you don't see us embracing renewables?
Eventually, definitely. By 2050, I think we'll be almost 100% renewables, except for something that to give us. So let's deal with that problem.
Yeah.
There are days on which there's no sun because it's cloudy,
right,
and there's no wind, and then your whole energy system collapses.
Yeah.
So you've got to have something to take care of that. Now you can store water by pumping when it's sunny, pumping water from, for example, Ranthambore to Randhanigala, from between Norton, Castlereagh, Mouse-Kelly. There's cascades of reservoirs. You pump water upwards when you have the solar peak.
Generation.
Yes, and then in the evening when we have demand, when people come home and switch on the lights and start doing the homework and cooking, you have this peak demand in the evening. And then you have to have electricity that's ready to go. The problem with having a complete renewable system is that it's not flexible, because you're dependent for your energy, rather than a switch at the moment, on having energy which is being determined by the weather god.
Yeah.
Now, just look at what happens on the average day when there is a 20-over match going on, right? Everybody at home is sitting and watching the match on television.
Yeah.
Suddenly there is an ad break. What do? You get up, you go get yourself a cup of tea, put the kettle on, right? Go and get yourself a beer, you open the fridge.
Spikes.
And there is a massive spike
in demand.
Now, if you're 100% renewables, you're stuck. So you've got to have battery storage or something to kick in at short notice.
Which is expensive.
Oh,
storage will be expensive.
Yeah, but pumped storage, which is prohibitive now, but it will become cheaper. But at the moment, pumped storage is reasonably inexpensive, pumping water upwards.
Yes.
And those turbines can be switched on with like 15 seconds notice. Okay. So you can manage it. But we're getting sidetracked.
Okay, all right. So in recent years, so corruption has eroded public trust. Like we can't trust in these assessments, because we had Hambantota airport being built, port city being built. How do you see the relationship between environmental degradation and corruption in governance? And what steps do you see that we can take to overcome this?
So two controversial comebacks to you. I'm going to get attacked.
No, that's all right. We're here for it.
One is that poor people don't care about corruption, in my view.
Okay.
I think most people below a monthly wage of about 100,000 rupees don't really care.
You're not alone in that view. We had Mr. Sumandiran here a couple of weeks ago, and he said exactly the same thing about the people in the north and east. I think that applies across the board.
Yeah. So there is that view on corruption, which is serious. The second thing is, as a people, we don't have respect for discipline. I'll give you a painful example. There was a study done of diplomats at the United Nations in New York. New York is one of the biggest cities in the world, and a really busy city, and it's very difficult to find parking. Diplomats have diplomatic immunity. there's a study done counting the number of unpaid parking tickets from various countries.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because these guys don't go to court. The
Yeah.
average Sri Lankan diplomat,
Yeah.
17 parking tickets in a year unpaid.
Okay.
Now, to my mind, this data has been out for a long time. To my mind, if we were a properly disciplined society, those guys would be fired tomorrow.
Right.
No ifs and buts, no inquiries, no show cause, you're out. You have brought disgrace on the country. There was another diplomat in a case in Australia where she had not been paying
Paying the maid.
maid. To my mind, these are like automatic firing offences.
Yeah.
The fact that we have a couple of days of publicity in the newspaper and we forget about it means that we really don't care about discipline. So social discipline is something that Sri Lankans are not bound to care about. We only care about it when we go overseas and we are forced into that. So to care about how politicians are running the country and whether they are making money on the side, that's why I say that this is a middle class preoccupation. This is not something that ordinary Sri Lankans care about. And we must make sure that they do care about it. But they don't. Because ordinary Sri Lankans don't understand the gravity of the country's financial predicament.
But I think what the Aragale did, at least for that short period, was to get people more engaged in those types of conversations. I think people,
come on, I mean, there's no petrol in the station, there's no gas, there's no electricity, of course.
That is what.
So the Aragale was an artifact in many ways.
Yeah.
Though I'm sure that many people like you were very sincere about it.
They understand when they are unable to even have 3 meals a day and can't even afford the basic necessities.
Well, them on the street, but beyond that.
I am sympathetic to that point of view, but as a parent I would be far more concerned about my children than about the meals I'm missing. And it's not that the children were missing meals, but the horrible predicament of our children. Remember, the crisis we're having today financially is because of the profligacy of our parents' and grandparents' generations.
Yeah.
Right? They were the ones who started this borrowing thing.
Yeah.
From 1952, from the time of the Harta, right? Sri Lankans were saying they want a free lunch. And nobody actually stood up to them and said, no, only beggars need a free lunch.
Yeah.
You don't get a free lunch. You work for it. Now, you have a situation where last year, 27 public holidays?
Yeah.
Right? How can you run a country? How can you run an economy?
We have made this point before, no?
Yeah, but if you go out and tell people you can't have it, no, not even the NPP is saying you're going to cut down public holidays. No. You lose an election.
Right.
So Sri Lankans have got used to being stupid about their own political outcomes. I can say this because I'm not looking for votes.
Right.
But it's people's stupidity that has led to this situation.
Yeah.
This is not stupidity of ignorance. It is the stupidity of greed. Yeah. Of really wanting something today without thinking about tomorrow.
Right. I think we need more of a reckoning as a population on all of that. So,
if you divide the national debt, we've got about $100 billion worth of national debt, including the rupee. Right? I'm just saying dollars for one currency. So about a third of that is foreign, and the balance of it is local. If you divide that by the voters in Sri Lanka, each voter has got $2 million rupees of debt in their name, on average. Yeah. You and me and you and we all have. Even the poorest people. Nobody got their consent to borrow money on their behalf, especially when that money can never be paid back and the debt is being passed on to their children.
Yeah.
I mean, what a horrible gift to give to a child to say, here you go, start your life and you're 2 million rupees in debt already.
Right, which is one of the arguments we have against this stability narrative. We are stable in the moment, and
yes.
Especially people who can afford to pay any price for groceries and gas will propagate that narrative.
Yeah.
But actually, we are just kicking the can down the road for somebody else to deal with.
Yes, and also it's even more cynical than that, because when we think about debt, this year the government's deficit is 2.4 trillion rupees. And it's debt servicing, without foreign debt, now we're not servicing foreign debt, this is local debt servicing, 2.7 trillion rupees. It's more than even the deficit. So debt is just pulling us down. And the worst part of it is, even amongst this English-speaking community, every time the ADB gives $400 million, or the World Bank gives $200 million, or IMF gives us $3 billion, it's like, we're home and dry.
Lighting
But
trackers.
all you're getting is more debt, for
More
God's
debt,
sake.
yeah.
This is so. I think if, as a community, as Sri Lankans, if we came together and we passed an act of parliament saying the government shall not borrow any more money. We don't care who dies, who has to fly economy without flying business. It's just tough luck. No more borrowing. You just stop it here. We shouldn't think of the ADB, the World Bank, and IMF as charities. They're not.
They're not.
They're in
banks,
it for the money. They're banks.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this so-called cheap credit we get from these institutions is absolute waste, especially the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. Most of the money they give us is debt. They give us some grants, but this money is pretty much wasted. There is no legacy. If you go around, look, you go to Victoria and you think the British government gave us this. Can you find anything the ADB or the World Bank gave us which has had an enduring legacy? Most of that money goes in consultancies, which they bring some foreign consultants and throw it away.
In fact, we know where some of the money went. It went into these sort of infrastructure projects and all that. And you make a point later on. Can we move on to that particular subject, the visa scam that you have taken a firm stand against? Would you be able to sort of explain the whole thing so that people, a better understanding?
So Sri Lanka, the government needs some revenue from visas. I just applied for a visa to Turkey. I had to pay $61. I didn't complain. People have to pay money to get a visa. We are all used to doing that every time we go somewhere else. So that's fine. But that money goes to that government.
Yeah.
So Sri Lanka has had, now it's all in flux because they're quickly changing the rules wherever they can because of this current problem. But we had, as at April this year, the intention of charging a foreigner about $40 for coming here, which is very reasonable. Now that $40 would have been normally charged by getting an electronic travel authorization, an ETA, which apparently is not the same thing as a visa, but it's very, as far as the customer is concerned.
It's just permission to travel,
yes.
And then you get the visa on the right.
Yes, but it's an administrative thing.
Right.
And from 2012 to this year, to 2022, that system was operated by Mobitel, I'm sure through subcontractors, but at virtually no cost. No cost because Mobitel was using that site. They had the opportunity to advertise products through that site, and so I think they were doing some of that. I don't know the details. And then, quite suddenly, on the 16th of April this year, Mobitel were told, we don't need you from midnight tonight. Out you go. We've got a new system. And the government had signed up a contract with a company called, I think, GGY Global something.
Yeah.
A company which has no background. You can Google it and see for yourself. And these people were told they can have $18.50 service fee plus a convenience fee of about another $7 or something. So it comes to about $25 for it. The government gets $40 and this nebulous offshore company gets $25.
$25. Actually, the entire amount, including the visa fee, goes to them for a period of, I think, 14 days before it actually comes back. So they all that entire cash flow is actually with a foreign company.
Yes. Now, the government's excuse for this, in fact, a minister of the present government contacted me a few days ago after my video went out and said, why did you do this to our president? Because you have said that this money comes from state coffers. It doesn't come from state coffers.
I'm going to come. I have a question.
This money is going direct to that company out there.
Yeah.
But come on. Who decides on that fee? It is decided by the government of Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
The government of Sri Lanka is obliged to get any revenue that it earns. The Constitution has a provision on this, I think it's Article 148, where any revenue to the government must come to the consolidated fund. After that, the government can pay out a fee.
Yeah.
But then it's subject to some kind of scrutiny in Sri Lanka. Here, what if the minister decided it's fair to pay the service charge of $1,000? Right? Or $10,000 to get a visa. Who decides on that number being reasonable?
Right, exactly. In fact, you had done a calculation where you estimate this to be about $59 million
$59
a year.
a year. and then you've extrapolated that over I think 16 years, or the value of the contract is 12 years? Or
10 years, extendable to 16 years, but not at our option, at the option of the contractor.
Right, so that in total, that's 285 billion rupees over 16 years.
But that again, like in the other case, is a minimum.
Minimum, because you've taken the current tourism arrival numbers as your base. Yeah. And there is a provision in the contract that says they can increase 10%. The convenience fee and the service fee.
Exactly.
So that's on an incremental scale. Yeah. So this is actually, you're right. I mean, this is an absolute minimum that you have stated here. So,
and you see, the metric I'm using to try and make this meaningful to people is to compare it with our education budget. We spend about 180 billion rupees a year on education for getting really lousy outcomes. In education, but still, that's how much we spend on education every year. This is like 3.5 times that education budget.
In fact, CK, if you can go to the current slide. So, you basically put it as education is 181 billion. The cost of this is 685 billion, which is 3.5 years budget of that.
Yeah.
And
so if I can add to that.
Of course,
All right. So let's look at education, because this is why we need to have more investment in education. Basically, 2/3 of all boys and half of all girls in Sri Lanka end their school careers as failures. 2/3 of all boys and half of all girls don't get to pass their A-levels. They drop out after O-levels for the most part. And what is the point of having this Nidahas Adhyapaniya system if all you're doing is producing failures? Right? So this education system is fundamentally broken. Yeah. And people, that should be where the Aragalia is, because basically everybody is being failed by that system. And
there's also a parallel tuition system, so it's not really free because people have to pay for that anyway.
Yeah, but despite the tuition system, this is the failure.
They're still failing.
This is the failure. And we don't see that in Colombo, because Colombo's got these so-called national schools, Royal, Thurston, Ananda, this kind of thing. It's only when you go to the village and you see the children who have to have the real education in Sri Lanka, which affects the 90%, not the 10%, that you see how abysmally bad education is, and how we are lying to the people by giving them this so-called education, which is just turning their children into drug addicts. I'm particularly worried about boys. My channel has got a 15-minute story about the predicament of boys in Sri Lanka. Because, remember, when you say 2/3 of all boys end their school career as a failure, that is a damning indictment on our society. Especially when you consider that 95% of the inmates at Valikada are men. Yeah. Boys go into crime, they go into drugs, and we are turning into a nation of three-wheeler drivers, like a nation of shopkeepers.
Exactly.
Where we'd really like our young men to aspire to something more than that. So that's why I say that this money, if it had to be made, let's make it and put it into education, because that is the most important thing.
Right.
Now, why do I find fault with all these political parties, whether it's NPP or Sajith or the other guy, Ranil? There's no consideration given to this kind of thing. When you consider how serious the education predicament is in Sri Lanka, this applies to everybody in this country. Yeah. Every parent should be worried about this. But the fact that we have a systemic problem in education that is creating generation after generation of failures, and pretending that somehow this free education is working, is a tragedy.
Yeah.
And that's why I think we need to really focus every extra cent we can find. So this money that is going on corruption now, if only it can be harvested and turned back into education, I think we'll be doing the whole country a favor. That's what I would like to see.
Right. In fact, one of our system change goals was to see more investment in education. We had looked at 6% of GDP or something like that.
Now
and also education reform as well. I mean, some time ago I made this statement that local graduates were unemployable in the private sector. I got a lot of pushback for making that statement.
I've made an even more provocative statement yesterday. I challenged a group of corporate CEOs and said, out of the 4 main presidential candidates, which one would you invite to sit on your board? And they said none.
Right.
And I think that's true.
Yeah.
Right?
So you made the point about debt, and you had one slide where you showed Nelunkuluna, Mattala, the airport and Hambantota all costing about $1.8 billion.
Whatever they.
And then these two scams in total over a period of time is costing around twice as much. So I suppose that is the cost of corruption you were talking about earlier, right?
It's at another level now.
Right.
And so, despite our being bankrupt, those were in prosperous times that that corruption took place. Now we are bankrupt.
So just quickly, we had a couple of audience questions on that. Our group, if there was a change in regime, what action can be taken against these particular deals? Can these be revoked or cancelled? Or is there a possibility that...
I'm not allowed to give details, but I've gone to the Supreme Court on both these cases.
Okay.
And I'm hopeful that those cases, which I think will be heard in October, will have positive outcomes, but the law is not my specialty.
But if there is a continuation of the same regime, what do you expect will happen? Then they
I can't
you can't get into details.
No, without being in contempt of court.
Okay, all right. No, we don't want you to be that.
No.
So, with the...
But there's one benefit.
Yeah.
If there's a continuation of the same regime, I will eat my hat.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
So
you said it on. Okay, you said it all right. That'll make quite a few of us happy, I think, around here. No, because our biggest concern has been, see if you can put this slide, the president himself has said governance is second, rebuilding the economy first. So that is the narrative, and that he hopes will, people will continue. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like we have to sacrifice one for the other, like we're sacrificing?
I don't see the connection at all. I mean, these are two independent things.
Yeah.
Governance is very easy to handle. It just needs some discipline. Right. I also have a take on especially on the corruption issue that none of these candidates has voiced, because I think there is a lot to be said on stopping corruption before it happens. The way that we have approached this is let people be corrupt, then we go and catch them and try and get the money back, which never happens. You can't catch them, you can't get the money back. And prosecuting them means the burden of proof is on you to show that it was happening.
Yeah.
But if I were a courageous president, and I put it to all these clowns, which they will never do, I said it, but you appoint a retired panel of Supreme Court judges and allow the public, if they smell corruption anywhere, to appeal that case to the panel. So, for example, if I'm saying the Adani case smells of corruption, I go to the panel, give my evidence, and say, look into this. Yeah. Your reputation's on the line, because these should be people who are above any kind of such consideration. I'd like to say people like us, who should be there. And then we say, bring the files, get the public servants, and see, why didn't you call for tenders for this, for example?
Yeah.
Right? We don't care who gets it, go and call for tenders.
Right.
Then there's no opportunity for corruption. So if you stop it before it happens, which in most cases is the case, that will take care of a lot of big corruption. The small corruption means weeding out, because small corruption is on regulations. If you have a huge regulatory network that you have to circumvent every time you want to do something, selling a piece of agricultural land means you've got to fill up umpteen forms, and there's discretion to delay that for years. Then you go and pay money to get it expedited. Similarly, I was talking to somebody who imports medical equipment the other day, why all these CT scanners are not working everywhere. Because the NMRA also regulates them. It not only regulates the equipment you import, but the spare parts for the equipment you import. So every time they want a spare part, you've got to go and get a permit from that guy. That guy calls you up. Then you have to go to the customs, bribe somebody and get it through. So when we put a regulatory framework in place that is designed not to work, because otherwise you can't have the corruption, of course you're going to have the corruption. So our job should also be to get rid of all this web of regulation.
Yes, so unnecessary deregulation on those things.
Yeah.
Okay.
But otherwise, you can still do it if you have the mechanism that I was telling you. One person at that institution whose job is to say no.
How do you feel about this independent prosecuting authority that they've been talking about? Would that help? Because I watched a video by Verite, Sankita, who basically said all these cases that are filed gets released on two grounds. One, insufficient evidence, or technicalities. On both counts, you can't file a case without sufficient evidence. So they can't then go and say insufficient evidence, which means somebody has to have died. Like somebody who's giving evidence has to have died, or evidence just disappears. or if it's technical grounds, they have to go back and refile the case again. So, right now the determination of both of that is being done by the prosecutor, the AG, who's also the government's lawyer, and the people who are complicit are also in government. So that is the conflict of interest. So wouldn't this independent prosecuting authority, basically circumvent that?
Yeah, like in the UK, they've got the Crown Prosecution Service, whose job it is to be the independent prosecutor, independent of the Attorney General.
Yeah.
The Attorney General is the government's lawyer, of course. That's different. But I think there are ways of getting around all these problems, or the way it works. If you take the Lasantha Vikramatunga murder, everybody knows who did it.
Yeah.
But that case has not been allowed to come to court
At all.
because the governments, whether it's Ranil Wickremesinghe's present government or the previous government or Maithripala Sirisena's government, have blocked the prosecution from ever being launched in the first place. You see?
And they persecuted the cops who were working on it and various things that happened.
So Shani Abhisekar, for example, went to prison for a year and a half for having been the lead investigator in that case. So when you have a police system which is able to be threatened by political process, then however clean your judiciary is, the case never comes to court. And the police have ways, I don't know whether you remember, during Chandrika Kumarathunga's time, there was a famous raga player called Joel Pera who was killed.
Yeah, Joel Pera. Yeah.
In the sight of many witnesses. And despite the person who killed Joel Pera being well identified, the police decided to prosecute somebody who had been in Kandy that day. And also the public says, well done, there's a prosecution, we're very happy. And then, of course, the case comes to court and it fails because that man was demonstrably not even Kalam.
I think Wasim Tajuddin case also.
Yes, I mean, that's another case like that. So I think it's bad to blame just the judiciary because the judiciary seems to do the best job it can under the circumstances. They're also handicapped. But this whole law enforcement thing has to be a sort of roots up reform.
Okay.
And I'm told that the NPP has looked at this very seriously and they've got Ravi and Shani as the prospective people who are going to reform the system. I have absolute confidence that both of them can do that actually if they come to office.
Right. So, we'll move on to the political side a little bit. So how do you view the choices we face at the election? I mean, we as a group believe that the incumbents favors the captured state that we're in right now. So we don't see any change with the continuation of the current sort of administration or Ranil Wickremesinghe and so on. What do you think either of the alternatives will offer if they have an opportunity to govern?
Before you dispose of Ranil so fast, I want to point out that he had an opportunity to be the Nelson Mandela of Sri Lanka. When he took over after the Aragalaya, it was in his grasp to be the transformative figure in the history of Sri Lanka. He let go of that.
Just like Mahinda had after the war.
Yes, exactly. But Mahinda didn't have perhaps the intellectual capacity of Ranil. Right? He couldn't have had the vision because Ranil's read all the books, he's read all the biographies and the histories. Yeah. So he has no excuse, whereas Mahinda probably hasn't done all that, and so he does. So that's why I feel disappointed in Ranil. I had a lot of hope for him because this was the golden moment, and the country was 100% on the side of the reforms. So if he got rid of, for example, the executive presidency as step one of his regime, he would have been like, people would have been clamoring for him to be the leader. But he just let that go. Because I think the greed for power is just too much. Anyway, let's leave Ranil at that. The other two people who are in the fray, I don't know the NPP people at all. I've spoken to a few of their leaders over time. I feel that they're well-intentioned, that they sincerely want to bring about a difference in Sri Lanka, but I worry about that. I worry about that because I see many of the same faces who were the downfall of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Vietmaga types, gravitating to the NPP. I've gone to a couple of their meetings and I see these faces there and my blood runs cold because, so another controversial opinion I have is that intellectuals can be a curse as well as a blessing. Right? If you look at Gotabaya's downfall, Gotabaya is not a clever man. He's not a outstanding intellect. but he's surrounded himself with intellectuals. His economic policy, who were the people? Dr. P.B. Jayasundara, Professor W.D. Lakshman, PhD, Oxford, economist, Vice Chancellor, University of Colombo, Kenneth De Silva, big shot at the back of Ceylon. Eminent intellectuals by any yardstick. Professor Chandra Jayasumana, Sudarshana Paniya, Dr. Anuruddha Padenia, consultant pediatric neurologist. These are not idiots. They're clever people. Professor Priyantha Yapa, the man who didn't want Muslims to be buried in case they contaminate groundwater. Yeah. Right? These are not idiots. These are very clever people. But it is the price you pay for intellectualism. I've got a lecture, which I haven't put on YouTube, but I must, on Nobel Prize winning idiots. and there are many of them. They're extremely clever, high IQ people, but absolutely stupid. Right? And I've got a long list of them, and I give this at university lectures because just to make the kids laugh. Yeah. Because you can be very clever and very stupid at the same time. What is necessary in politics is not genius, it is common sense. And I often tell people that the common sense of the kind that your mother has is the best kind of thing you need for politics. Yeah. Just the way you run a household, like being frugal, by being disciplined, by making sure that everybody gets a fair share, that's a good politician. You bring these very clever people into politics and they're usually disasters. Look at G.L. Pires. What a sorry spectacle, but a very, very clever man.
Yeah, in fact, we gave it, during the article, we went and gave a letter to him. We asked him why he's still, I mean, if you have integrity, you would resign and leave, right? Yeah. And he sat there for so long.
Yeah. So that's my point. So I worry about NPP getting involved with these intellectuals, and intellectualism is wonderful, as people would consider me an intellectual. That's why I don't go into government because I feel that government needs people with common sense and a certain amount of testosterone. Basically, you've got to be tough to go and do the job.
Yeah.
As far as Sajid is concerned, I think he's got a super team. I think Kabir Hashim, Iran, and Harsha, stellar prospective ministers. I don't know has the public confidence to do this because he says silly things. And this is often a problem. So this is the point at which somebody like you asked me about, aren't you his advisor, to which I have to say, not exactly.
Okay, all right, okay. Because that's been the way that certain people have attacked you because you've released these videos. Because you attack in the administration, they see you, that as implicit support for somebody else. And because there are pictures with you and Sajid.
Well, when you play cricket, you always bowl to the batting side, right? What's the point of bowling to the fielding
side? Absolutely.
So it makes no sense.
Right.
But the fact is, I'm not formally an advisor to Sajid Premadasa in the same way that I'm an advisor to Sajid Premadasa. I'm an advisor to maybe a dozen politicians who call me from time to time for advice. But I've not met Sajid for more than 2.5 years. And I've never been appointed as an advisor to him.
Okay.
But I have high regard for him, and I'm happy to give him advice. And he does call from time to time and ask me for advice, to be fair.
Right.
But so do many others.
Right. Okay. So
I've also been an advisor to
Ranil Wickremesinghe, you mentioned earlier, right? That's it for the main sort of presentation I had. There was a question through our Twitter handle, so I'll ask you that question. Dr. Patel, can you comment on the fact that we have had so many high corruption, but the AG messed up the cases and most ministers did not go to jail? Was it intentional? All done by activists, Airbus Steel, Immunoglobulin, VFS, Pandora Papers, Gin, Nilwala, Nano Fertilizer, Garlic Scam and things like that? I think sort of answered already, but since the question has been posed.
No, it's a valid question because I had forgotten about some of these cases. Yeah. First of all, correction, I'm Mr.
We can give you the list.
Full list.
Hang on, I have to say this. Mr. Petegoda, not doctor. I don't like pretension, so everyone calls me I'm Rohan, that's the way he's asked it, that's fine. And I have to clarify, every time I go and give a lecture and I'm introduced as professor or doctor, I have to say, no, I'm so-and-so. I think the reason these cases don't get prosecuted is because at the fundamental level, all these guys are chums. Regardless of which party it is, they're all friends. Whenever there's a wedding and they come to the wedding, they all go and sit at the same table. Right? So basically, these are friends. They look after each other's back. The idea is that you don't attack someone when you come into office. That's why for the whole year they left Gotabaya strictly alone. The MIG deal was waiting to be had, Lasanta's deal was waiting to be had. The police had done all the investigation, but they didn't touch them because whoever, I know the person, but I'm not going to say the name, the minister in charge of the police at the time didn't want them prosecuted.
Yeah, so I think...
So it's a club.
Right, that goes to the captured state that even Murtaza spoke about when he was here. But the funny thing is, since we had done some work, we put the 3 manifestos through an AI engine, and we said find commonalities. The NPP and the SJB manifestos have 88% commonality. So it's actually the 12% that they're mudslinging over, which is kind of ridiculous if you really look at the substance of it. There is a bigger difference with the gas can manifesto, because there's only about 6% commonality, because the gas can doesn't have anything on governance or prosecuting corruption or abolishing the executive presidency. So I think those are the stark choices.
But I think, if I can just put my 2 cents worth against all those 3, I haven't seen them, by the way, but I can be sure that none of them will point out that government expenditure this year is 6.6 trillion rupees. Government revenue this year is 4.2 trillion rupees.
Yeah.
There's a deficit of 2.4 trillion,
yeah.
right? Government borrowing stands, as we just discussed, at $100 billion US. Every one of us is now in debt. What is each of these parties going to do to take us out of that predicament?
Can I just ask you a question on this?
Yes.
Nobody touches the military budget.
Nobody.
Military
In fact, I was going to ask you.
But you can't. It's a toxic item.
Like a sacred cow.
Nobody
You
wants a
can't
coup,
touch it.
but to be fair, Ranil has cut down military spending quite a lot. So in his 2 years...
But in his manifesto there's nothing.
No, you can't talk about it, because if you do
But
that...
the
SJB talks about attrition and things
defense
like
budget
that.
in rupees is high because we had 100% inflation, but in real terms it has come down, and the military hasn't been boosted the way it was before during the war. This is a sensitive issue, and I think I'm sympathetic to politicians who want to deal with it sensitively, because you can't suddenly send 50,000 young people who have been trained.
Oh no, absolutely. I don't think anybody will suggest that.
No.
But nobody would even touch it, because it's such a huge item on a.
But there is one other interesting point, that many civil society people like you all say we want fewer ministers because you object to the amount of privilege that ministers get. Ministers have roughly the same privileges as a brigadier general in the army. There's 400 of those.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so nobody talks about them. They get the 2 cars, the house, the servants, the drivers, the whole works, the backup vehicles, and that never comes up for... There might be bullets through my house today for saying this. But the fact is, that is the reality.
Yeah.
So those privileges need to be cut down as well.
Right.
And does the army really need so many golf courses?
Right.
I can't see why. Or so many hotels? I think 18
Well,
hotels...
they should be running business.
18 hotels in Sri Lanka belong
to the
military. This is crazy.
But aren't they running it as business units?
No, they're running it as recreation for their staff. It was a business unit.
There's a few.
But even if it's a business unit, it becomes worse, because then that business unit doesn't pay VAT. They don't have the same overheads and costs as people who are running a genuine hotel industry are having. They're not covered by wages ordinances. Nobody can. I know. Yeah. But nobody can go to labor tribunal against them if they get fired. So they're not playing on a level playing field.
themselves.
And they're competing against the genuine tourist industry, which is doing it the hard way, and making life more difficult for them. So no, that's wrong.
The same issue in construction also?
Yeah. Where you have the state competing with the private sector.
But actually I was wondering, in 2027, we have to pay the loans, no?
Yes, so we're going to become bankrupt again. I got criticized for saying this once before, but look, Argentina's done it 4 times in the last 20 years. Yeah. It will happen again and again. That's
bankrupt and get money from the World Bank.
No, you don't. You renegotiate every time. The IMF will lend you more and more money. Remember, the people who are lending us money are never expecting us to pay back the capital. They just want a long-term source of revenue, of interest. The capital is another deal. That's for your grandchildren to worry about.
But even to pay the interest, we need foreign currency.
Yes, and we don't have it now. The central banks, I think their total reserve at the moment is about $5.5 billion.
Yeah. So they have at the moment,
yes, to service a debt of 37
Well, that's because
billion.
we are not paying it.
We haven't paid
We
for the
are-
last 2 years.
we
That's
have
our
not
savings
paid,
are
yeah.
told.
Yeah, exactly.
But how are we going to pay? I mean,
We are not going to pay. We're just going to declare. we
no,
are
even the
insolvent.
interest, we have to pay some amount.
Well, yeah.
But if you can't, you just declare insolvency. That is this is a kind of an ongoing process.
If you read the manifestos, there are lots of stories on how they're going to pay.
No,
right?
none of them have talked about that. How to pay?
They all have economic plans and they presented. We went to a couple. Right? So can we move on?
To start with, take away 20 public holidays, you probably increase GDP
Your
by
productivity
2%.
side,
Yeah.
right, there you go. Just a final point from one of the questions that our guys have asked. I'm sure you can weigh in on this. The rule of law issue that we have with the president, how do you view that? Like he's this kind of ignoring Supreme Court sort of orders and things like that. That's actually a question from, given that he's a lawyer himself, is what the question.
Unfortunately, he personally has immunity, so there's nothing much we can do about him except vote him out of office. That is.
That immunity extends once he's out?
Yeah, but for acts committed while he is the president,
he has immunity for that.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I don't think
that's asked and
So he'll have immunity only for the 2.5 years.
for acts committed as president.
Yes.
If he kills somebody, for example, he has no immunity, but anything he does in his capacity as president.
During his term, he is
Yes, he
immunity.
has. But the answer to the problem also is to take away those powers from the leadership. I think that hopefully the new constitution will do, that the NPP is promising, and so is Sarit, that there will be a new constitution. But the constitutions aren't an answer. The constitution only shows that we can't make our damn minds up, because we've had so many amendments to this constitution. This is the fourth constitution since we became a democratic nation in 1932.
Yeah.
So we have to think very carefully about the meaning of constitution and why we keep going around in the circle of not making our minds up. It's because we give too much power to government and then we want to take it back. So in the first case, if we don't give it, in the first instance, if we don't give that power.
But right now we can see some glaring holes, right? One, we don't have the right to recall. That's why people have to get on the street and protest and go through such a painful process to get rid of a clearly incompetent or dangerous government that collapsed the economy. The other is that a person who constitutionally sitting as the president but didn't get a popular mandate. So these are clear holes. So we clearly need a new constitution. Right? I mean,
I don't
those
think
things need to be.
That won't really solve the problem. Because if you think about 1970 to 77, Mrs. Bandaranaike's government, she had a prime ministerial system of government, absolute autocracy. There were no freedoms at all. Everything was censored. Newspapers who went against her were acquired by the government and shut down. So you can have a prime minister heading the government and still have a very dictatorial, autocratic system. We've been there before, so you shouldn't look at that as the panacea. The difference as to why the Aragali succeeded is largely because of social media, the organizing power of social media, and the fact that Gotabaya was not willing to shoot. So you have to give him credit
for that.
Because
Absolutely.
If he started shooting, he could have stopped it quite quickly,
Yeah.
like they tried to do in Bangladesh.
Right. In fact, I think some questions were asked of the military why they didn't shoot afterwards. That was all that. Rohan, thank you so much. You were very generous with your time. I know you have a flight tomorrow and so on. Any other questions that is burning in the top of your heads quickly before we let Rohan go? Yeah?
I have one question. Do you think we have any hope for this country?
Yes. Yes, I'm optimistic. I think it can be put right. This is not an insurmountable problem at all. I'm very confident that with a bit of clarity and social discipline, we can come out of this.
Thank you, Rohan. On that positive note, so Leisha usually finds a couple of quotes to end the discussion that's appropriate to what we've been talking about. Leisha, what have you got for us this week?
So my first one is, no other touchstone can test the heart of a man, the temper of his mind and spirit, till he be tried in the practice of authority and rule. That's Sophocles.
Yeah.
I think I pronounced that.
Very good point.
It.
Very good point.
Yeah.
And the last one is, you can't just leave those who created the problem in charge of the solution. So that's why we need change.
Yep.
Yeah, we've been advocating people to vote. I mean, if you don't, because a lot of people are asking us, everybody, they're looking for a unicorn to come and solve this. There's no unicorn. There's no perfect solution. So what we've been advocating is, if you can't decide on who to vote, eliminate the worst and see what you're left with and vote accordingly.
Yeah.
So with that, shall we? Any final thought, Ron?
No. Final thought is hold your head up. if we are a proud and disciplined nation, we can do this.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much, Rohan. So that's a wrap from us on day 309 at GGY. Next week will be our last roundtable before an election. We haven't decided what we're going to do with it. Let's think about it. You guys will be back at the SweetCon on Sunday for day 310. And thank you, Rohan. Thanks to the team and Anu and CK. And that's a wrap from GGY. Thank you.
Well done, guys. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.